Well, we are back in Acts chapter 17, made somewhat famous because Paul is going to give this defense for the hope that lies within him, yet with gentleness and respect, as 1 Peter 3:15 says. And he's going to do it from a location that has been known for hosting such debates and councils. Paul has been invited after preaching the gospel in the synagogues and in the streets and marketplaces of Athens to the Areopagus, or literally Mars Hill. Areos being the god of war, Pagus meaning stones, so Areopagus means the stone of Ares. You say, well, why do we call it Mars Hill? Well, the Romans renamed all the Greek gods, and so Ares became Mars, and so they called it Mars Hill. Now, according to Greek mythology, Ares was put on trial for the death of Poseidon's son on that spot. But of course, that's just one of those mythologies that substantiate a tradition. During the Greek Empire, the Athenians frequently did hold councils there to determine important trials, and even up to the time of Paul, when the Romans were in charge, not the Greeks, the Council of Areopagus was still very influential. It's not likely that they met on this little stone outcropping. They probably met nearby at an actual building or facility where they would debate and judge important legal matters and so on. So it seems like that at the time of Paul, on the actual hill, the actual physical location, the teachers and philosophers of the day would come and explain and defend their views. And, they're doing it on a very historic kind of location. So it was a well-known thing. This is where, again, Paul is, as he's been invited by the Epicureans and the Stoics to defend his claim that Jesus Christ is divine and also has resurrected from the dead for the sake of sinners. We know that Paul had already spoken to them of these things, according to Acts 17:16 and Acts 17 and verse 18. But now with the larger audience, Paul is resetting, and he gives this gospel presentation freshly. Now, many people come to this passage as a paradigm for apologetics. If you've ever heard that term before within Christianity, apologetics is not the science of apologizing, or at least not in that sense. The word apologia or apology, which that's where we get our word for apology, actually means like a defense. Is even in a legal counsel to give a formal defense for your cause or for your view of the circumstances. So an apologetic is something that many Christians developed, especially in the early church, to defend their faith against the claims of not only Jews, but Gentiles as well, and friends and neighbors, as they had to substantiate why they believed what they believed. Why are you doing things quite Jewish as far as the Old Testament's concerned? And so they have an apologetic for the Jews. In the Roman Empire, well, you're proclaiming a strange religion here. What's going on? Do you bow down to Caesar or not? And so the Christians had an apologetic for the Romans. So too now, of course, most Christian colleges have a realm or field of study for Christian apologetics, and that is the art and science of defending our faith. And in current context, it means addressing the different cults and religions and worldviews out there from a Christian point of view. Now, coming again to Acts 17, so many people see principles of apologetics and draw those out from the text here, and I think that's a worthwhile pursuit. In some ways, that will be what we are doing this morning. But just so you know, there is no silver bullet when it comes to apologetics, meaning there is no ironclad argument for the existence of God or for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, such that if a person hears it, they're obligated to believe. Like, oh, well, I guess I have to be a Christian. There's no alternative. I do think there are some very ironclad arguments for the Christian faith, but the true problem is not a logic problem. That is not what sin is a purely logic issue. Sin is a heart issue. Sin is an attitude and a relationship issue between man and God that doesn't always make sense. To a certain degree, to defy God is absolutely ludicrous. No logical person ought to go against the creator and maker of the universe, but Satan did, Adam and Eve did, inherently illogical. So, unfortunately, as much as a Christian might have every single argument against, Buddhism or Islam or any other kind of worldview or religion, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you just say these words, the other person will have to submit to your superior arguments. There's no silver bullets. Having said that, though, there are principles we can glean from what Paul says on the hill that day. There are principles that we need to communicate to folks because whereas there's no silver bullet to something we can say that obligates faith, God does choose us to use us as vessels to proclaim the truth, and God, by the proclamation of the truth and the power of the Holy Spirit, does change lives. So, another way of putting that is God uses our diligence in proclaiming the truth of God to save souls. That's true. Even if there's no one singular argument for the Christian faith that just this gets everyone between the eyes. There's sometimes where I think that some preachers and some apologists just sound like salespeople, and there are some salespeople tactics that just work very well, practically like a silver bullet, and we ought not to think of something like that. So, principles here of apologetics, that's where we're going with. We're not going to get super far because the first principle is going to be about God and who He is and what we can understand about Him. And for me, it's very hard to move past that. So, Acts chapter 17, verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Now there's going to be a few times where this happens where Paul is going to use an atypical word. And what I mean by that is not that like, oh, Paul, you're not allowed to use a thesaurus when you preach, and you're not allowed to use other words, say for worship or service, than what's typical. But I think he does use different words than he normally would for a distinct purpose on Mars Hill. And one of those words here is for very religious. There is a word for spiritual, and he doesn't use that word. And there is a word for godly, and it's not that word either. It's a unique word that essentially, from my perspective, the connotation's like, you try to do good. You're trying to worship, but these are wasted efforts. So in some ways, some of the words that he's going to use sound like backhanded compliments. So I think this is Paul being very intentional about his word choice here. And he's saying, he's not trying, in other words, he's not actually trying to say this is a good thing, that you're very religious. You know, that kind of like sarcastic way that you might hear that is what he intends. Like, oh, I can tell you're a very religious person when you're just talking about the outward appearances of religiosity. That's what he's getting at here. Now, there is something to say for the fact that Paul does want to point out a common experience and a common observation. And this is something I think is a valid apologetic tactic. In other words, remember, Paul is in Athens. He's waiting for Silas and Timothy to meet up with him there. He's doing some sightseeing, and he sees these 30,000 something odd altars, temples, and statues, and it provokes him in his spirit, and so he has to go and preach. So he is using this very common observation of all of these idols to point out, to make a connecting point with the people there, and especially this one where they are so concerned with cover all the gods, even make an altar to the catch-all god. Like, okay, just in case the junk drawer that just has anything else where you have a spot for it, this is the junk drawer God. So if there's anything that we forgot, neglected, anyone we left out, just that guy. So Paul is just using that. He's not actually saying that that was an altar set up to Yahweh or anything like that. He's just using that as a touchstone, a connecting point. It's a sympathetic observation, though, to say, like, obviously you're very religious. This is pointing to the fact, like we said last week, that everyone does have a worldview. Everyone has a belief in God, whether you call it God or not. Or, to put it simply, everyone is very religious. Now, you might say, well, I know people who claim to be atheist. I know people who might be Buddhist and don't practice, or are Christian, but they don't go to church, and they're not very religious at all. They're very even a-religious. Of course, you probably have friends who are very much hostile to religion and think very negatively of it. Well, all of these people are religious if what you mean by that is they all have some kind of explanation for purpose, for morality, for our origins, for our meaning and definition. These Epicureans and Stoics, if you remember, they were almost atheistic, functionally speaking, but they did still have a very sophisticated worldview and rationale for what they considered purpose and value in life. Well, guess what? That is their religion. I know, it's not anthropologists might be like, well, it's not exactly a religion because you need to have these certain facets, but let's just calling whatever you ascribe as the reasons for your life, for your origins, for your purpose, I think let's just call that your religion, or even your God, even if there's no God. So, I think that claim that you are all very religious is still very relevant today. People are still very, very religious even now. We have to be, because we're made that way. And we'll get there probably next week. That is their idol. That is their God. So it's inherent. It's built into us. Ecclesiastes talks about how eternity has been built in, you could say, to our hearts, to our worldview. Anytime anyone, even a secular person, appreciates a sunset or a butterfly coming out of a chrysalis or bops their head to some music they like, frankly, that is all worship. That is all an acknowledgement of us being religious people, us being made in the image of God. Every time someone makes a judgment about right or wrong, every time someone creates something, every time someone feels like they're made for something more, that's all coming from we are all very religious. And I think that's helpful because that means that everyone has a common place to connect. I'm not necessarily advocating for watch every single piece of media that's out there or always be so current with the news or watch the latest popular shows. But everyone, you have your interests, you have your hobbies, you have the thing that you're into. And I guarantee even woven into that is some element to the truth that we have a worldview, we make judgments. I mean, I think reality TV exists for you to be judgmental. And even in people being judgmental about how other people live their lives, that is telling you something about God, right? So even when people get together to talk about that, I don't watch a lot of reality TV, but when the people get together to talk about that and be all judgmental towards other people, that's religion, making a judgment on others. That all points to God. So we have that in common. We have God in common, or that at least awareness of living in a moral world, that awareness that there's purpose and meaning, morality, awareness that there's beauty and creativity. Who's not agreeing with that? What person does not see that? Perhaps only the most psychopathic people or people that are in comas. They can't acknowledge that. But pretty much everyone you know and everyone in this room, I see that you're all very religious. I could say that if I talked to any one of you. So we got that in common. Well, Paul then continues on saying, I'm going to proclaim to you now what really is the common tide that makes sense of our religiosity. What is the best sense or explanation for that? He says, verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is not actually far from each one of us. Well, this is going to be the bulk of the message this morning. Paul says in basically one very long sentence, verse 24 through 25, so many glorious, fascinating, wondrous things about God. We have to talk about it. And maybe the way we could sum it up is that there is only one ultimate, or there can really only be one religion, or there can only be really one God, or there can only really be one explanation. Because as soon as you allow for two, then you have to debate between which of those two. Now, how can we, as finite creatures, debate which one of these is truly God when, by definition, this God's going to be above us, right? So then it makes us the judge of who God is. So there can be really only one explanation, one God, one ultimate. It doesn't make sense to have two ultimates, does it? Because then one is not the ultimate. There can only be one all in all. There can only be one reason. Other problem with having multiple is as soon as you allow for two, then there's why not 3? Why not 5? Why not 10? Why not 100? Why not 8 billion? Can they all be true? Is each one as valid as the other? I told this story before. I remember being at UCI and this gentleman, he took one of our tracts, he took a bite out of it, spit it out, and walked away. He said, all roads lead to heaven. Everyone's right. No one's wrong. Your way is as good as my way. That kind of thing. As he's storming off, right? And he said, what if my way says your way is wrong? Is my way still right? Right? Like, how can you say every way is right if my way says that your way is wrong? Am I right? Obviously, so many problems. That's why there can be only one. The notion of God, and let's just say God in the generic sense of the term God. I'm not trying to say Yahweh's not God. Let's just say that. But the notion of God has to be someone, something ultimate, absolute, unparalleled, without equal, utterly unique. So in contrast to the multitude of gods in the Greek and Roman pantheons, in contrast to the pagan cultures that so often made gods of everything under the sun, every creeping thing, the Bible reveals a one and only God. We call this monotheism. And in fact, monotheism is rare. on planet Earth. The major monotheistic religion is Judaism and everything that has come from, say, Judaism, meaning the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament. Christianity, obviously rooted in the Old Testament, but even Islam and other religions that claim the Bible is sort of true, those are the only monotheistic religions on earth, pretty much, are ones that come from this Bible. So you and I, probably growing up in the Western world, you might think it's like obvious, like, yeah, only one God. Well, in comparison to human history and time and culture and civilization, monotheism is actually very unique. And yet, it's what makes sense. Again, how can there be more than one ultimate? How can there be more than one cause? And that's the first thing that Paul goes for. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it. Very fundamental, basic principle is that God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. It's how our Bible starts. It starts at the literal beginning. Again, not every religion starts that way. Not every text and worldview starts really at the beginning of everything. It's hard to avoid the conclusion, ironically, because other religions don't necessarily talk about it. But it's hard to avoid the conclusion just based on cause and effect that the world, and here the world and everything in it, the word for world there is the Greek word cosmos. We get the word cosmos from it. So this doesn't just necessarily mean the literal landmass of the world. I think it wouldn't be inappropriate to say the universe, that he made the universe and everything in it. Based on cause and effect, that principle operating in our universe, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, it had a cause, because you can't have an infinite regression, going back. Well, what made that? What made that? What made that? What made that? At the heart of it, there has to be, and every worldview has to have, an uncaused cause, or the causer. Whatever you think that uncaused cause is, that explanation for everything, capital E, explanation for everything, that is effectively God, whatever your worldview is. Maybe it's Big Bang or whatever. That's like God then to you. Now, God always has a personal connotation, but let's just, again, this notion of God, that's God to you then. Forces and laws of physics. But there's a ton of problems with that, because what are the laws of physics? Where do they come from? Why are they the way that they are? Can you have laws of physics when you don't have anything? Is there something? What did the Big Bang explode into? What is that thing? That's a thing also. What caused that? It's like saying that my drawing started when my pencil touched the paper. But where did the paper come from that I drew the drawing on? So even if you have a Big Bang, it happened in something. What is that? See, what caused that? You have to have an uncaused cause. Whatever that is to you, that's basically God. Now, let's be honest, no one's going to sit here and try to explain reality, as a whole, just reality as a whole. That's a whole nother subject. But to begin with the creation, what we know, this is a thing that we all agree on. Are we here right now? Can we agree on that? This is the thing that's happening right now. Where did it come from? Paul's very clear. The Bible's very clear. Again, a little bit in a contrast to a lot of religions out there, that there's one creator. And the most obvious fact of being a human being with cognitive abilities is to perceive that there is a world around us that has been made, because cause and effect. Where did these pews come from? They were made, cause and effect, cause and effect. You keep going back. Where did you come from? Don't need to get in the weeds about that, but cause and effect, back, right? What is again unique, though, when it says that he made the world and everything in it, is it, again, vocabulary. There's a very common Greek word that Paul uses over and over again for creation, creator, created, and it comes from the Greek word katidzo. You don't need to remember that, but that's almost any place where you see God created, or creator, or creation. It's some form of that Greek word katidzo. That is a normal word that he uses. But Paul here uses a different word. It's poieo. Poieo, we get the word poet from it. For example, in poem. And this also means to create or make, but it has more the connotation of a creative work or an expression, an expressive work. Katidzo is like the founding or origin of something, but poieo is someone made something, and it has that personal touch to it. Of course, the word poet, having that coming from that word, it has that connotation of an expression of a personality. Now remember, many of the philosophers that are listening, they were not necessarily like, oh, I believe in Jupiter and all these other gods. Like, they had to subscribe to it to a certain degree because everyone else believed it. It's like politicians say they're Christian because they want to get your vote, but are they really? I don't know. It's kind of like that. Of course, you believed in these pantheon gods, but even as we talked last week, many of them were functionally deists, D-E-I-S-T, meaning that if there was a God, all he did was create and then leave the creation going and have nothing to do with it. It's barely not atheism. It's practically atheism. They had no problem with the idea that God would, let's say, katidzo the universe, create it, found it, start it up like a watch, and then just walk away. But poieo implies that personal element. God is invested. He cares about what he's made. It's a subtle vocabulary, just like earlier when he said, I perceive you're very religious. He's saying something. He's making a comment. He's not using that typical word. He's using one that suggests, or not just suggests, that it evokes the image of someone crafting something that he cares about, that's invested with his personality and interest. And that is not like the deists. And that is not like these philosophers there. In fact, the relationship is that of Lord. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth. Of course, the word there for Lord is kurios. See that all over the New Testament. And that is a statement of authority and power. This takes God's personal investment one step further. In fact, that there is a relationship where we are dependent on and subservient to the Creator. Lord is a relational term, which we often associate negatively because, hey, we don't like submitting to anyone. We don't like anyone telling us what to do. Don't tread on me. It just, especially Americans, very independent and woven into our being. But the word Lord doesn't necessarily have that negative connotation in the Bible. If there is one, that's owing more to our sin. It's mainly the idea that someone is in charge. Someone has a power and authority to accomplish their will and purpose. Someone has a responsibility or duty to care and to take care of. That's what lords did, a true lord did. It's not just a despot, not just an authoritarian or dictator, but someone who understood there are people underneath him that relied upon him and depended on him. It also means that we are, as the created beings, under someone else's charge and care, that our duties and purposes are determined by someone else and not ourselves. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what is God's relationship to us in Genesis 1 and 2? What does his lordship mean? Well, in his lordship, he said, I've set you on the earth. You need to be fruitful and multiply, and you need to exercise dominion over this earth and this world. That you are actually the ones in charge here. I am, God saying in his lordship, saying, you are the lords of this world. It is for you. Take care of it and fellowship with me and walk with me. It's not such a bad deal. Really, they were not going to get a better deal. And they still, of course, sinned and fell short because the one thing they could not do or be was be God. Do what God does. The irony is, of course, here it's saying that he's Lord of heaven and earth. That's Lord over people and beings. But, he's Lord of every molecule and atom and particle, that they all follow the command of the Lord. They submit to the order he has created. Every galaxy and nebula, down to each, boson and whatever else is smaller than that. They all submit to the lordship of Christ. It is just humans and the fallen angels, those who have personality and being, who have fallen short. Lordship is not supposed to be a bad word. We were created with the purpose to serve God by exercising authority and care over the world he made for us, and to be with him and enjoy fellowship with him. Well, lordship is not a bad word when we consider what we were made by him to do, which was to glorify him by sharing in his glory. Paul goes on to say that this God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. That is to say, God is unconstrained. He's not bound by anyone or anything. God does not live in temples made by man. Literally, the word is handiworks. From the Areopagus, you could see the Acropolis with its temples and statues and sanctuaries made to honor the different gods and deities. You would be able to see the Parthenon from the Areopagus, remnants of which, of course, you can still see today. That was a temple dedicated to Athena, whom the city was named after, Athens. And recall, what prompted Paul here was seeing all of this handmade, human-made crafts and handiworks that were supposed to somehow capture the gods in some way, be a place where the gods dwelt or lived in some way. But to even think about it points out the problem. How could a God dwell in a place made by a man? Thinking it's an awfully small God that could fit in that temple, as large as it might be. Or to think that a God could not go outside of that temple, as if it is trapped. That's an even worse thought. The inherent problem is that the gods of those days existed in time and space, or were said to live in a time and space, constrained as we are, stuck within three-dimensional space, experiencing time as we do. That is a very small God. Now, you might say, didn't Israel build a temple to Yahweh? Well, notice Solomon's words of dedication after he built the temple. This is 1 Kings chapter 8. David his father could not build the temple, even though he wanted to, because his hands were too bloody. And God promised, your son will build it for me. And at the dedication in 1 Kings 8, 27, the whole chapter is really good. But in verse 27, he says, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his plea, O Yahweh my God, listening to the cry and to the prayer that your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open night and day toward this house, the place of which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may listen to the prayer that your servant offers toward this place, and listen to the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place, and listen in heaven, your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. Solomon was no dummy. He knew, God is not just, stuck now in this little temple that I made for him. Even the highest heavens. And by that, he didn't mean the clouds, he meant the universe, the place where the stars and the galaxies are. Like even that, now we know that's so much bigger than what Solomon might have conceived of, but even that cannot contain God. He knew that. He was aware of that. He knew that this was a place on earth that represented his presence, where God chose to be there, not in his actual containment, but his name would be there. It's kind of the way we view the White House or talk about the place as the authority, but it's not as if the president is always there, but you'll have candidates saying they are seeking the White House. What does that mean? The location? No, they don't mean that. They mean the office and the authority that it represents. So it's sort of like that the temple represents the power and the authority of the title of God. But it's not that he is there all the time. He's everywhere. His authority doesn't have any restriction or bounds. So going back to Acts 17, again, everything that he's saying here, in my opinion, is very logical, rational, reasonable, etc. This is not like he's trying to stretch their minds with fanciful ideas here. I think it very much would have appealed to their very logical, philosophical, argumentative nature. But he goes on to say that this God, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Literally, he's not served by human hands. And again, interesting is the choice of words, the vocabulary here. There's a word for service in Greek, diakoneo, which is where we get the word deacon from. And that means to serve, right? To serve like a waiter serves. It gets applied to the deacons because they are doing a service for the people. There's also another word for serve or worship, latruo, like idolatry. The latry is worship. So it's idol worship. Idolatry is idol worship. So we get a Greek word, latruo, which is like religious service, religious worship. But Paul doesn't use that word either. Those are the two words you would expect for him to use for like God is not served by human hands. Come on now. Instead, he uses the word therapeuo. Now, therapeuo is where we get the English word therapy from. And its most common use in the New Testament is for healing. Therapeuo means to heal, and it's the most natural or a common usage. So when Jesus healed the sick, it's he therapeuo. He did that word. In fact, the only place where you see this word in terms of service is here in Acts 17. Why? Why is the word for healing kind of used in the service context? Well, I think there's an overlap of ideas here. Is the way that people have to wait upon or attend to a sick person. The nurses at a hospital often do things for a patient that are very servant-like. They'll feed you, they'll turn you over, they'll clean you and wash you up. It's very servant-like stuff. But why? Because as a patient, you are in a helpless situation. You're not commanding their service because of your honor or authority or because you're some higher up. Almost the opposite. You're not in an honorable situation. You're in a helpless, desperate situation, and you can't do anything for yourself, so someone else has to do it for you. So Paul's choice of words is deliberate here. He's painting the worship of the Greeks and Romans like nurses attending to sick patients. Who are the sick patients? The gods. Oh, they need help. Like, they're so helpless, they just sit there. And the statues need to be wiped off. These statues need to be, these gods need to be helped. They're helpless. They can't do it themselves. They need constant attending to, like a sick person. It's a subtle dig, right? Your gods need help going to the bathroom. That's the kind of service you're giving to them because they're so weak. But not Yahweh. Yahweh doesn't need anything from us. Doesn't need our help. He's not some poor spirit just languishing unless someone gives him a hand up or hand out. I often see on the internet a comment made by both Christians and non-Christians that goes something like this: God created us because he needs worshipers. Christians say that, I think, in a well-meaning way, that, to say that our reason for existence is worship. I get that. Of course, non-Christians say that in a critical way. God is so egotistical, he needs people to grovel and serve him, or he is so, weak and helpless that he needs us to do something. He needs something from us. Well, actually, God doesn't need anything. He lacks nothing. He's God. A God that needs something is a God that is impoverished, is without something. How can God be without something? How can he need something outside of himself? Our worship is not providing something he lacks. Our worship is glorifying him. It's acknowledging what he is. John Piper says, what does it mean to glorify God? It does not mean to make him more glorious, that adds something to him or to supply something he needs. No, he says, it means to acknowledge his glory and to value it above all things and to make it known. So worship or glorifying God isn't about adding or giving something to him that he needs or lacks. It is just the recognition that God has chosen to make his glory known by us, all right, to make his glory known so that we can see it, but also to make his glory known through us, that we are vessels that get to magnify, reflect his glory. Not adding anything. We get to witness his glory, and then in this stunning miracle of God's will and kindness to even share in it and show it to others. It doesn't lack anything. That's what worship is. Worship is not a weak or egotistical God demanding something from us that he needs, either his own vain glory or in his helplessness. Because, as he says here, from him, he gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. God is self-existent. He is the source of existence. He's a source of life. How can he be the source of everything and lack something? This is sort of the argument. And this is just further hammering in the point. He points out that unlike the Greeks and Romans who give life to the gods, right? They gave life to the gods by creating stuff and saying, this is God. So it's like they are the ones giving life to the gods by, making a statue or some graven image. They also give life to the gods by using them to explain natural phenomenon, to explain morality. So in a way, they're giving life or meaning to the gods. In other words, the people are giving the purpose and the meaning to the gods, using them to explain things or to get people to do things. But the God of the Bible is the one who gives us life and breath and everything else, like purpose, like meaning, like dignity, like worth. Again, there's an irony to the fact that man throughout history has created images and statues and temples and altars and said, this is our God. He lives here. He needs this. When they knew full well that they had just crafted those statues and figures with their own hands. That if their God is hungry and needs to be fed, is no God at all. The Bible is so clear from its opening pages that we are the ones made by him, not the other way around. That he is the one that gives to us, not the other way around. And we, being uniquely made in his image, were created to worship and know him. And we'll talk about that next week. We'll talk about that next week. If you're not a Christian this morning, I know that I could give you the most logical defense of the Christian faith. It still may not penetrate a heart that is resistant. Because really the issue isn't whether you can comprehend the logical flow of the argument Paul is giving here, but a heart that is stubborn and resistant to God because you are not God. The root of all idolatry is to elevate man above who God is, to take the things that man has done and make them greater than the things that God has done. There's no higher arrogance or pride. There's no humble way to be an atheist or worship other pagan gods, because ultimately it is a reflection of you. The Bible is calling you to repent and submit to this God who has given you everything, though you have rejected him, who sent his own Son as the ambassador to lay down his life in order for reconciliation to be made through the forgiveness of sins in his blood. If you're not a Christian, the Lord is calling you to repent, because one day there is a judgment coming. We'll talk about that next week, that there's a time when God has allotted for everyone to stand before him in perfect justice. And if you cannot plead the blood of Christ, you will get what you deserve, which is an eternity of judgment and torment apart from his presence, apart from all that is good and beautiful and lovely. But today, if you would turn from your sin, turn from your self-idolatry, God will welcome you with open arms. If you are a Christian this morning, I hope something here encourages you or challenges you in your thoughts about God, or motivates you to go and share the gospel with someone that you love or someone that you hate. Because the message of the gospel is for everybody, maybe especially for the people you hate.